This is chapter 7 of the book that we are reading, What is the Declaration of Independence? Today's chapter is going to be The King Must Go. When word of the battle between the Massachusetts colonists and the Redcoats spread to the other colonies, fear took over. Great Britain had the most powerful army in the world. How could the ragtag militias possibly defeat the Brits in an all-out war? Only a few weeks later, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. This time they met in Independence Hall, and this time delegates from all 13 colonies attended, 56 men in all. Some were lawyers, some were businessmen, and some were farmers. Many of them were wealthy. Some, like John Hancock from Massachusetts, were extremely wealthy. All were leaders in their colonies, and as at the First Continental Congress the year before, some delegates still held out for hope for a peaceful solution. Where were the women? Were there any women at either the First or the Second Continental Congress? No. Back then, no woman was considered the equal of a man. Although colonial women joined protest groups against the king, and some even fought in disguise after the war broke out, they were not intended to have any of the rights that the colonial men so desperately wanted: the right to vote, to make laws, and to control their own destinies. In the United States, women did not get the right to vote until 1920. There were some new delegates to the Second Continental Congress. Benjamin Franklin, a well-known writer, printer, and inventor, was one. He urged the colonies to split from Great Britain. So did Thomas Jefferson, a farmer and a scholar from Virginia. Both of these men were gifted speakers. At the Second Continental Congress, they helped persuade others to their way of thinking and helped change the course of America's history. During the summer of 1775, the Second Continental Congress made many important decisions, including creating a real army, not just militias, to fight against the British, voting George Washington from Virginia as the commander of the new army, and printing their own money and refusing to use the British pound, organizing a navy to fight against Great Britain's powerful ships, sending Silas Deane from Connecticut to France to ask for help and money to fight the British. In July 1775, the Second Continental Congress sent King George III another letter. The delegates were making one last try to avoid war. John Dickinson of Philadelphia wrote the letter. He believed that the colonies should stay connected to Great Britain. At the end, Dickinson wrote, "That your Majesty may enjoy a long and prosperous reign, and that your descendants may govern your dominions with honor to themselves and happiness to their subjects, is our sincere prayer." Dickinson's letter was saying that the colonists hoped that King George would rule over America for a long time and bring happiness to everyone. What did Sam Adams, Ben Franklin, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson think of Dickinson's letter to King George III? Well, they despised the idea, but the letter was sent anyway. How did King George react? He refused to read the letter. He wouldn't even look at it. The king's silence convinced even delegates who had hoped for peace that staying connected to Great Britain was no longer possible. Thomas Paine's common sense. Thomas Paine was a British man who came to America in 1774 with the help of Benjamin Franklin. Paine was inspired by what the colonists were doing to combat the British Army. In January 1776, he published a 48-page pamphlet called Common Sense. Paine argued in plain language why America should split from Great Britain. Common Sense became the best-selling pamphlet in America. 500,000 copies were bought. That meant at least one out of every 4 colonists read it. Paine's words were read out loud in pubs and in meeting halls throughout the colonies. General George Washington had Common Sense read to his soldiers. Thomas Paine could have made a fortune from his pamphlet, but he accepted no money from its sales. He gave nearly all the profits to the American Army for uniforms and for weapons. And there's a picture of Thomas Paine. I'm also going to read to you today chapter 8, Declaring Freedom. What needed to be done next was clear. The American colonies had to tell the king that they demanded to be their own country apart from Great Britain. The notice they sent the king would have to make it completely clear that the colonies had no choice but to go to war. They did not expect the king to be persuaded by anything they said, but they did want other countries to understand that the colonies had been forced to rebel against the King of Great Britain. But who was best suited to write something so important and dangerous? The members of the Second Continental Congress turned to 5 men: Ben Franklin of Pennsylvania, John Adams of Massachusetts, Robert Livingston of New York, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. The group thought that Jefferson should write it by himself instead of trying to do it together. Jefferson wasn't so sure about that. He and Adams were close friends. Why didn't Adams try writing it? But John Adams wouldn't do it because, as he told Jefferson, "You can write 10 times better than I can." So the job fell to Thomas Jefferson. For 2 weeks, he worked on the first draft of the Declaration of Independence. He was renting a second-floor room in the home of a Philadelphia bricklayer. The house was on the outskirts of town. Jefferson wanted to be away from the noise of the city. He used a quill pen that he had to keep dipping in a bottle of ink, and he wrote on large, oversized sheets of paper. He wrote early each morning, stopping when his room became too hot. Pen, ink, and parchment. Today, pens are manufactured so cheaply that losing one and having to run out of ink is no big deal. However, in the 1700s, writers made their own pens. They used a quill, one of the large feathers from the wing or tail of a bird. Quills from geese, crows, and swans were commonly used. Thomas Jefferson owned special geese, so he had never run out of supplies. The tip of the quill was sharpened with a knife to make a pen point, and then the quill was dipped in ink. Ink was made from all kinds of things, like berry juice or even soot from the fireplace. The signers of the Declaration used iron gall ink from melted metals and plants. Important documents weren't written on paper, but on parchment, which was made from dried animal skin. The Declaration of Independence on display at the Library of Congress is on parchment. Rich colonists who didn't want to make writing supplies by hand could buy them from a shopkeeper. Traders often sold fancy European quills, ink, and parchment at local seaports. Later in the day, Jefferson spent time with other delegates from across the colonies. Even though he was kind of a quiet man, Jefferson talked a lot about the Declaration. With his friends Franklin and Adams, he frequently discussed exactly what needed to be included. Sometimes when he returned in the evening to his room, Jefferson would crumble up what he had written before and start over. The Declaration would start a war. Jefferson understood that fellow colonists would die because of his words. Jefferson was a scholar, a man of learning. He had read many books and written many papers on various subjects. He was a student of the Enlightenment. It was a period of time between the mid-1600s and the late 1700s when men turned to the power and truth of science over what they saw as the superstition of religion. He had read many of the great thinkers of the day, such as John Locke of Great Britain. Locke put forth a daring idea, that human beings are born with certain rights, and that these rights cannot be given or taken away by kings. Thomas Paine's common sense also made a big impact on Jefferson. In writing the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson tried to combine ideas of new thinkers with the political goals of the American colonies. The Declaration of Independence had to do 2 important things. It had to explain why the colonies needed to break away from Great Britain and King George, and it had to describe what this new country stood for. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 4 parts. The first part was an introduction, explaining that the Declaration would show why the colonies needed to be free. In the second part, Jefferson laid out the ideas on which the new country would be built. After living without representation in Parliament, the new country would be governed only by the consent of the governed. That meant citizens would have a say in what the new government did, and that every man would have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the most famous part of the Declaration of Independence. Again, remember, it's talking about men. Women were not going to be full citizens allowed to vote. The third part was the longest. In it, Jefferson lists all the unfair things that Parliament and the king did to the colonies: imposing taxes, stopping trade, closing down colonial governments, and forcing colonists to let British soldiers live in their homes. The king had heard all this before, but Jefferson wanted the whole world to see how badly that Great Britain had treated the colonies. In the final part, Jefferson introduces the name of the new country, the United States of America. He also clearly states that Great Britain will have no control over the United States, none at all. Jefferson was pleased enough with what he had written to show it to Ben Franklin and John Adams. Both suggested a very few minor changes, which Jefferson made. The Declaration of Independence was ready to be presented to the Second Continental Congress. Richard Lee's Declaration. Richard Lee was a wealthy Virginian and a strong opponent of King George III. Lee wrote articles and fought against the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts. He also helped organize groups in different colonies that worked together to fight against the British. Lee's hatred for the British was clearly on display during the Second Continental Congress. On June 7, 1776, Lee proposed the following: that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all the allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Many members of the Second Continental Congress agreed with Lee, but not enough colonies were willing to support Lee's proposal to pass it. However, Thomas Jefferson was so impressed with Lee's powerful proposal that he used the exact wording in the Declaration of Independence to announce that the United States of America would be completely free from Great Britain. And there's that picture of Lee. This ends our video for today. I will be reading you Chapter 9 and Chapter 10 tomorrow. Thank you for listening.